Thanks, Helen. So I'm going to talk today about another participatory budgeting pilot, this time in Govanhill in Glasgow. And what I'm hoping to kind of impress upon you today is that participatory budgeting is very much a kind of action-orientated tool. So moving from some of the big issues that we've spoke about today, some of the frustrations perhaps that we feel about how to move things forward, participatory budgeting, I believe, could be a central tool in all of this, and it could be, central to a lot of what we take forward. So today I'm going to just describe for you, give you a wee bit of background around participatory budgeting, tell you a wee bit about its history and where it came from. I want to talk a wee bit about participatory budgeting within the current political landscape. I know that doesn't sound terribly exciting, but it gives you a feel for some of the drivers in the way our current government is thinking about things, and to do with communities and localism and so on. I'm going to talk very briefly about the study methods. I promise I won't take too long there. And the study findings. We're going to outline the process that we adopted in Govanhill and the learning themes that emerged. And then just going to get into some discussion points and leave you with a couple of key challenges. So how do we define participatory budgeting? Well, participatory budgeting directly involves local people in making decisions on the spending and the priorities for a defined public budget. So it moves way beyond traditional notions of community engagement and consultation. It's about the community having the budgets themselves and deciding how to spend it democratically. It transfers responsibility and accountability from the state to communities, so it's obviously not a case of just handing over money. With that comes the responsibility and being held accountable for the spend, although it needn't be an onerous kind of process, and indeed capacity needs to be built within communities for that. But fundamentally, participatory budgeting is about deepening democracy, and I think that point is overlooked quite a lot in some of the literature and the way it's described. So it's about engaging local people to participate in a political process at the local level, and it allows them the feeling and the chance to have a say on how things are shaped within their neighbourhood. So it's very important there. And where participatory budgeting is done well, and it's done continuously, you actually see a greater turnout for normal elections, local elections and national elections, which is a real issue for Scotland and Glasgow particularly, given the democratic deficit in the city. So participatory budgeting originates from Porto Alegre in Brazil, following the demise of Brazil's military dictatorship. So going from one extreme to the other, the people in Brazil were absolutely adamant that we were going to decide how to do things for themselves, and a huge chunk of the public services in Brazil is decided through this participatory budgeting approach. The evaluations from Brazil are very, very positive in terms of the outcomes. They invested a lot within infrastructure that was missing in deprived areas, deprived regions of Brazil, I should say, and schooling, education. So there's a lot of really, really good outcomes, but also very positive in terms of the process that was adopted and the spin-offs from the process, which we've heard a lot about from Newcastle there. What form does PB take? Well, within the UK at the moment, not to sound too cynical, it's tended to be community grants, so it's tended to be small pots of money that are delivered, that are kind of put into communities, and there's a long way to go before we get to the top slicing, which is what takes place in Brazil, where up to 40% of the entire public sector budget is decided through PB. And what are the benefits of PB? Well, we've heard a lot of these kind of phrases today, and rightly so, but this slide here summarises some very high quality evaluations, some very thorough work that's been done throughout kind of Latin America and indeed in the UK. So when PB is done well, importantly when it's done well, it enhances community engagement and it adds an extra pull on top of normal sort of community development approaches, and it can be shown to really engage the socially excluded. It does enhance community empowerment, again, if it's done well, and it does increase confidence and skills, that kind of co-production approach, where everyone working together, the community, the public and the third sector is working together, achieves more. Of all the kind of partnership approaches that I've been around for the last kind of decade or so, what I observed in Govanhill was, I would describe as the most meaningful kind of interaction between the communities, public and third sector. There was a real sense of purpose, and I believe that was down to the PB process. And it can lead to innovative projects that, again, not to be too disparaging of myself or public sector colleagues, but projects that the public sector probably wouldn't fund or wouldn't think was an appropriate thing to fund, or wouldn't, it's just not conducive to our cultures. And it clearly demonstrates the benefits of partnership working. This is an important point, the final point as well. It can lead to additional funding for disadvantaged areas. So where you can demonstrate that participatory budgeting is well embedded within a community or a region, you are more likely to attract funding from large funding bodies, for example, European funding, and so on. So there's a bit of an issue there around kind of the front loading of our budgets. So I've heard examples of PB where it takes £100,000 of investment to spend £25,000 with the community, which may seem absurd, but you need to view PB as a very long-term process, and that £100,000 is well spent if it builds the capacity and the resources within the community and the public sector and the third sector to work together. So how does PB fit within the current kind of political landscape? Well, PB involves devolved decision-making, community empowerment and increased democracy. It's about transparency, so it's transparency of how the money is used, the process through which it's spent. Localism, voluntarism, so voluntarism meaning getting communities to lead things, to take on board more responsibility, to deliver services within the community. And these are all at the core of the current political consensus. PB is quite unusual in that it's supported by both the political left and the right at the moment. So the left are interested in, of course, increasing kind of engagement and being a more kind of equal society and including as many people as possible within decision making. The right, quite cynically, you could kind of say, are more interested in saving money in communities, doing things for themselves, that kind of individualised discourse that we see from the UK government at the moment, and that sort of spills into welfare reforms and so on, but emphasising the role of the individual in helping themselves. So within Scotland, PB is absolutely bang on the money in terms of the Christie Commission, and I'm surprised there hasn't been more links made around this. So Christie says that reforms across the public sector must aim to empower individuals and communities receiving public services by involving them in the design and delivery of services. In terms of health, the Marmot Review, similar ethos there, that local delivery of services, health services, require effective participatory decision-making at local levels. And again, the assets-based approach, which we've heard a lot about today, focuses on community empowerment and participation and that shift in the public sector's mindset. So, until recently, though, I would argue within Scotland, certainly PB has been somewhat missing in action. And it probes some questions. Is there a lack of awareness of PB within Scotland? There is a degree of cynicism around the empowerment agenda, as I've described, amidst the cuts agenda. Is empowerment and community engagement just a vehicle to achieve more for less amidst the cuts agenda? You could argue, not being disrespectful or disparaging to any of the projects that are presented on PB, but overall, in terms of a national response to PB, you could argue that it's been a somewhat anemic response to what PB could be. It seems it's kind of random, depending on how forward-thinking some public sector workers are within given areas. It's somewhat random where it's implemented, and it tends to be quite small scale. However, again, within Scotland, there's the recent Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill consultation, which has an entire section on participatory budgeting, so I think that's a real forward step. At least it's on the radar. And within Glasgow City Council, there's the commitment now to community budgeting, which I believe is essentially participatory budgeting. So there's been good progress over the last year or two, so that's very positive. On to the Govanhill pilot. I don't have time to go into a lot of the detail, but basically £200,000 of government money was awarded to the area around community engagement. And the local partners in the area were wanting to do something different, something a bit deeper than the normal kind of community engagement and consultation. They wanted to go, as I say, a bit deeper there. So we decided to try participatory budgeting. They did it with the newly formed Govanhill Community Action Group, or GOCA for short, and that's quite an interesting group in that all the community groups in Govanhill, which was around about 23, I believe, at the time, were contacted and they were asked to nominate or elect one member from each of their group to form this kind of super group. Didn't quite go according to plan like that, but we did get a reasonable turnout. I think on average there was about 15 members of the community groups that turned out regularly, and the process was supported by the Community Health Partnership, City Property, and facilitated by Oxfam Poverty UK, and that was turned out to be a really important facilitation role. The whole process was endorsed by local community planning partnership partners as well. And Govanhill as well, just to say, is an area in the south east of Glasgow which faces a number of inequalities, social, health and economic inequalities. It's also an area with quite high antisocial behaviour as well, and it's a multi-ethnic minority area as well. So just quickly, the PB pilot, it was a qualitative study that I used to evaluate it. It's 2 focus groups with the GOCA members, interviewed all the public sector partners involved as well. And the findings, the process that we adopted is kind of over five sort of stages. There was a kind of gearing up for PB stage, the first 2 stages there. The first one being the formation of GOCA and its emergence as a credible partner, and that was seen as a group that you could use or could pilot work like this with. There was also cultural shifts within the Community Planning Partnership and the Neighbourhood Management Group in the area towards doing something like PB, towards definitely handing over a bit more control and responsibility to the community. The process was over 3 stages. There was first of all a special meeting of GOCA to discuss local priorities, and this was quite a lengthy meeting, I seem to recall. Went on quite late into the night. And again, that was just teasing out what the local priorities were. There was then an invitation put out to wider community groups in the area and indeed the community as a whole through various ways to engage them in the process. As I'll speak about, that wasn't that successful, to be honest with you. It mainly stayed within the existing kind of 15 or so community groups. And then proposals were considered from the groups and decisions made at the GOCA meeting. There were 3 kind of projects that were funded. The first was with the Govanhill Addictions Family Support Group, where £40,000 was used to purchase a caravan in North Berwick on the east coast, and this caravan was to be used by families who were affected by a family member having addictions. So it was a respite facility, and a lot of kind of the funding was used for transporting families back and forth to this respite facility. And from what I hear, it's very well used and well maintained. The Govanhill Community Justice Partnership were awarded £60,000, and that was to fund a lawyer. It seemed, again, a strange decision, but it was felt that within the area of Govanhill there were a lot of migrants that weren't able to fully exercise their fundamental human rights, be it with kind of rogue landlords, the benefits system, and a range of kind of issues there. And so the lawyer as well linked in with local partners as well, and there's been a number of good outcomes there, not just for the migrant population, for the entire Govanhill population, the resources therefore. The Govanhill Baths Trust were funded £50,000 for health and wellbeing programmes, and they were also awarded £50,000 for a capital grant to develop the Baths building that was closed about 10 years ago, and open part of it at least as a community kind of hub. So that's how the money was used. Just a few learning themes, just very quickly, from the process. The independent facilitation provided by Oxfam was absolutely fantastic, and I can't speak highly enough of that. It was just a kind of neutral partner within it all, and I suppose it illustrates further, if needed, the role that the third sector can play in this type of work. The GOCA members, unsurprisingly, embraced the responsibility and empowerment and were absolutely more than equipped to deal with it. So there's always this worry, I think, perhaps within the public sector at times, as to handing over money and responsibility. Are they going to be able to do it? This group were able to do it, certainly with a bit of support around some aspects of it. The GOCA members were very strategic in using the funding, so they were clear that they didn't want the funding just to be a pot where £200 and £500 was drawn out here and there willy-nilly at a time. They wanted to fund no more than a handful of big projects and projects that would really make a difference in the area. Interestingly, they were unanimous in prioritising people ahead of place. They weren't too concerned with the built environment. They were more concerned about projects that would have an impact in people's lives, kind of social interventions. Even the funding of the baths, the redevelopment of the baths, you could say that's a capital investment, and of course it is, but it was more symbolic of the baths trust being reopened in the community, and that would have a kind of social ripple effect in the area, and I believe it did. And definitely, the abandoning of the status quo, funding caravans and so on. I know it's not, internationally innovative, but it was quite innovative within the south of Glasgow. Some things we didn't do as well. There was a lot of time pressures within the pilot, and that directly impacted on other aspects of it. So we felt like we were always rushing to get through it. Which I'd advise you not to do if you're thinking of that. It does take time to build up awareness of the programme and build capacity within the community. Community representation within the Govanhill pilot could have been better, without a doubt. And I think this raises wider issues. One of the presentations earlier talked about representation, and I think representation should be something that's always sought. It's definitely a goal, in the recognition that will never be fully achieved. So within Govanhill, for example, there's like 50 languages spoken on a daily basis. You're never going to get a manageable group that's totally representative of the area, but you have to try. And the time pressures is within the pilot, limited how representative the group was. Transparency within the process. I think it was a transparent process, but for reasons that are not, devious, some of the applicants had spoken to public sector partners about various aspects of their application or their bid, whereas others didn't know they could. It was perfectly acceptable that they were doing so, but it wasn't perhaps as equitable across all the applications, and so that was an issue. One of the things that came through was the desire from the public sector involved for community professionalism, in a sense. So whilst there was all these other issues that impacted on community representation, that we did kind of uncover through the interviews that there was a desire to engage with the more professionalised community members, and how that would be, in a sense, easier, if you like, for a process like this. But again, that was related to time pressures and so on. But the main thing for me, one of the key kind of learning points for me, was that the PB process in Govanhill definitely built some pretty strong foundations. As I said, the public sector, the community and the third sector coming together for a prolonged period of time with a real purpose in mind. And as I say, it was way beyond kind of engagement or consultation. It was actual action together. So for me, there's a strong foundation in Govanhill, and that's only going to be good going forward. Just very quickly, just to finish up, like any democratic mechanism, the process in Govanhill was not perfect by any means, but PB does fit with the kind of current discourse that we're seeing and the principles within our policy in Scotland. And it's important to recognise that PB is a well-established and internationally researched localised democratic process. It's something that can be applied in any community. It's not new, and there's a good body of evidence out there. As I said, it does bring together the partners in a meaningful way, and it can really enable closer partnership working. Crucially, it adds a significant pull alongside other community engagement processes for disadvantaged communities and the socially excluded, and it can mobilise assets. So just in short, within Scotland certainly the current policy and political landscape is absolutely crying out, in my opinion, for a tool which can deliver all of these things: community empowerment, devolved decision making. But the acceptance of PB has been slow in Scotland, and perhaps this can only be achieved when the value of working with communities is recognised, evidenced and accepted. And I'd be interested to know if you think we're there yet. It needs strong leadership, clearly. It needs a lot of capacity buildings, and lead-in time is important. So you can't expect results overnight. And I spoke earlier about front-loaded investment, this idea of putting a lot of money into communities to engage them properly, be as representative as can be, and build the skills within the communities to take this work forward. That might need time and investment up front before you even get to the process. So importantly, cultural shifts are required there. Just a couple of key practical challenges just to finish off. It's interesting whether PB actually has to involve the physical transfer of money towards communities, or whether communities would be happy to have the budget allocated and make the decisions themselves, and then the public sector can do it. That would certainly be easier, and there's less legalities. But I'm just wondering what you think, whether if a community group can get hold of 100 grand, I'm pretty sure they could maybe get better value than the public sector procurement routes, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. Again, community representation is, the real challenge. It's a very important challenge. And how do we get past this idea of the usual suspects? I think that's a term I hear quite a lot, and I don't agree with it. I think it's quite disrespectful. I think if people want to turn out and give their energy and time year after year in a community, then they can only be seen as assets, and it's about working with those people and broadening engagement. But that's a question I get asked quite a lot: how do you get past the usual suspects? And this desire, the cartoon before can illustrate it as well. How can we get past this desire for community professionalism within the public sector? How can we work with communities without asking them to be like us, and how can we, is that an unexplored barrier within engagement? So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.